The morning sun had barely crested the Arizona mountains when Samuel Lawson spotted the figure stumbling along the dusty trail toward his camp. A woman dragging herself forward with determination that seemed to outweigh her strength. He stood from where he had been feeding mesquite branches into his campfire, watching her approach with the wariness that kept a man alive in 1883. The territory between Tucson and Nogales was harsh country, and folks did not often travel it alone unless circumstance had stripped away better options. His hand rested near his revolver, not threatening but ready, as the woman finally reached the edge of his camp and stopped. She was young, perhaps 20 or 21, with auburn hair escaping from a braid that had started the day neat but now hung in disarray. Dust coated her divided riding skirt and white blouse, both practical garments that had seen better days. Her face was sunburned across the nose and cheeks, and her lips were cracked from thirst. But her eyes caught his attention most, green as spring grass and burning with a mixture of exhaustion and fierce pride that would not let her collapse despite her body's obvious need. "I apologize for intruding on your camp," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "My horse threw a shoe 5 miles back and went lame. I have been walking since yesterday afternoon." Samuel relaxed slightly, though he kept his assessment sharp. "You have been out here all night." "I had little choice in the matter." She swayed slightly, catching herself with visible effort. "I do not suppose you might spare some water. I can pay." "Put your money away," he said, already moving toward his pack. He pulled out his canteen and brought it to her, watching as she took it with trembling hands. "Drink slow. Small sips or you will make yourself sick." She nodded, raising the canteen to her lips with such relief that he felt something twist in his chest. He was 26 years old and had been riding the territory for the past 8 years, working cattle ranches and taking odd jobs where he could find them. He had learned to read the desperation in people, and this woman wore it like a second skin beneath her determination. When she had taken enough water to restore some color to her face, she handed back the canteen. "Thank you. I am Eleanor Owens. Samuel Lawson." He gestured toward the fire where his coffee pot sat on a flat stone at the edge of the flames. "I have coffee brewing if you want some. And beans left from last night." Her stomach answered before she could, growling loud enough that they both heard it. Color rose in her cheeks despite the sunburn. "I would be grateful for anything you could spare. As I said, I can pay." "We will talk about payment after you have eaten and rested," Samuel said, retrieving a tin cup and plate. He poured the strong black coffee and ladled cold beans onto the plate, handing both to her. "Sit before you fall over." Eleanor lowered herself to the ground near the fire with less grace than she probably intended, her legs folding as if they could no longer quite support her weight. She held the coffee cup between both hands, breathing in the steam before taking a careful sip. Something in her expression eased, a softening around her eyes that made her look younger and infinitely more vulnerable. "I had forgotten what coffee tasted like," she murmured, taking another sip. "We ran out 3 weeks ago, and there was no money to buy more." Samuel settled across the fire from her, giving her space while studying her more carefully. Her clothes, though dusty and worn, had been well made once. Her hands showed calluses but also careful attention to her nails. She was educated based on her speech and carried herself with a bearing that spoke of better circumstances now fallen away. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Nogales." She ate the beans slowly, clearly forcing herself not to gulp them down. "I have an aunt there who I hope will take me in. I have not seen her in 10 years, but she is the only family I have left. That is still a day's walk from here, maybe more in your condition. I am aware." Her chin lifted slightly, that pride flaring again. "But I will make it. I did not say you would not. Samuel poured himself coffee, considering the situation. He had been heading northwest toward a ranch outside Tucson where he had prospects for work, but his timeline was flexible. I have a horse that can carry double. I will take you to Nogales. Eleanor's eyes widened. I cannot ask you to do that. You must have your own destination. You did not ask. I offered. He met her gaze steadily. No woman should be walking this territory alone. You are lucky you made it this far without running into trouble worse than a lame horse. She was quiet for a moment, emotions playing across her face too quickly for him to name them all. Finally, she said, "Why would you help me? You do not know me." Do I need a reason beyond it being the right thing to do? In my experience, men always have reasons. The words were not accusatory, just tired. And those reasons generally benefit themselves. Samuel could not argue with that assessment, not honestly. He had seen enough of the world to know that kindness often came with strings attached, particularly where women were concerned. But he had also been raised by a mother who had taught him better, even if consumption had taken her when he was only 15. "I suppose you will have to decide whether to trust me or not," he said. "But I give you my word that my only intention is to see you safely to Nogales. After that, we part ways and you need never think of me again." Eleanor studied him with those sharp green eyes, and Samuel had the distinct impression that she was seeing far more than he might want to reveal. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I accept your offer. Thank you." They broke camp an hour later after Eleanor had rested and eaten more of his supplies. Samuel saddled his buckskin gelding, a sturdy horse named Buck that he had owned for 3 years, and helped Eleanor mount. She settled in front of the saddle horn, her back straight despite her exhaustion, and Samuel swung up behind her. He kept his arms loose on either side of her as he took up the reins, trying to give her as much space as the arrangement allowed. "Comfortable enough?" he asked. "Yes, thank you." They rode south along the trail, the morning sun climbing higher and bringing with it the fierce heat that characterized the Arizona summer. Samuel kept Buck to a steady walk, not wanting to jar Eleanor too much in her weakened state. She held herself carefully away from him at first, maintaining a gap between her back and his chest that spoke of her wariness. "How did you end up out here alone?" Samuel asked after they had ridden in silence for a while. Eleanor was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, "My father died 6 months ago. We had a small ranch east of here, closer to the New Mexico border. After he passed, I discovered that he had debts I knew nothing about. The bank foreclosed on the property. I had nowhere else to go except to write to my aunt and hope she would remember me kindly enough to offer shelter. I am sorry about your father." "Thank you." Her voice was soft. "He was a good man who made some poor decisions. He borrowed money to buy more cattle, thinking he could increase the herd and pay back the loan within 2 years. But we had a drought, and then disease took half the stock. There was no recovering from it." Samuel nodded, having seen similar stories play out across the territory. Ranching was uncertain business in the best of times, and these were far from the best of times. "What happened to the rest of your herd?" "Sold at auction to pay toward the debt, though it was not nearly enough. The bank took the land, the house, everything." Bitterness crept into her tone. "I was allowed to keep my horse, my clothes, and $50. I used 30 of it to buy supplies for the journey. Then yesterday my horse stepped wrong and here I am." "What about your horse? Where did you leave him?" "I took off his saddle and tack and turned him loose. There was nothing else I could do." The pain in her voice was evident. "He was a good horse. I hope he finds his way to water and grass." They rode on through the heating day, stopping twice to rest Buck and allow Eleanor to walk around and restore circulation to her legs. Samuel shared his canteen freely. and the jerky he kept in his pack, watching as Eleanor ate with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to waste a single crumb. During their second stop, sitting in the shade of a rocky outcropping, Eleanor said, "You have not asked me the question that most people would." "What question is that? Why I did not marry? Why I do not have a husband to take care of these matters?" She looked at him directly. "You are wondering, are you not? I figure if you wanted me to know, you would tell me." Samuel took a drink from the canteen. "Your business is your own." "I was engaged," Eleanor said after a moment, "to a man who worked at the bank in town. When my father died and the debts came to light, my fiancé decided that I was no longer a suitable match. He broke our engagement 3 weeks before the wedding. Then you are well rid of him." Eleanor blinked, surprise crossing her face. "That is not the response I expected." "What did you expect? Some platitude about how he must have had his reasons, or how difficult the situation was for him?" She shook her head. "That is what everyone else said. Any man who would leave a woman he claimed to love because her circumstances changed is not worth the powder to blow him to hell," Samuel said bluntly. "You deserved better." Something in Eleanor's expression shifted, a crack appearing in the careful walls she had built around herself. Her eyes grew bright with unshed tears, and she looked away quickly, blinking hard. "Thank you for saying that. I am only speaking the truth." They reached Nogales as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the adobe buildings clustered along the border. The town straddled the line between the United States and Mexico, a bustling place full of merchants, ranchers, miners, and all the people who made their living serving those industries. Samuel guided Buck down the main street, aware of the attention they drew as a man and woman riding double. "Where does your aunt live?" he asked. "Carson Street, if I remember correctly. The last letter I have from her is several years old." Eleanor looked around with uncertainty clear on her face. "I hope she is still there." They found the house after asking directions from a woman sweeping her front step. It was a small adobe structure with a neatly kept yard and flowers growing in pots by the door. Samuel helped Eleanor dismount, steadying her when her legs threatened to buckle after the long ride. He tied Buck to the fence post and walked with her to the door. Eleanor raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. Samuel saw the fear in her face, the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether she would find welcome or rejection on the other side of that door. "Only one way to find out," he said gently. She nodded, squaring her shoulders, and knocked. The woman who answered was in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a bun and a face that showed laugh lines around her eyes. Those eyes widened as she took in Eleanor's appearance. "Good Lord above! Eleanor, is that you?" "Hello, Aunt Margaret." Eleanor's voice wavered. "I am sorry to arrive unannounced. I sent a letter, but I do not know if it reached you. I had nowhere else to go." Margaret did not hesitate. She pulled Eleanor into her arms, holding her niece as Eleanor finally broke, tears streaming down her face. "Hush now, child. Of course you came here. You are always welcome in my home. Always." Samuel stood back, feeling like an intruder on the private moment. He started to step away, intending to slip off quietly, but Margaret looked up and caught his eye. "And who is this?" "Samuel Lawson," Eleanor said, pulling back and wiping at her face. "He found me on the trail after my horse went lame. He brought me here. I owe him my life." "Then you must come inside, Mr. Lawson," Margaret said warmly. "Let me offer you supper at the very least, and a place to stay for the night if you need it. I do not want to impose. It would be an imposition to refuse after you brought my niece home safely." Margaret's tone made it clear that she would not accept any argument. "Besides, I have stew already made and more than enough for 3. Come in, both of you." The house was small but comfortable, furnished with obvious care. Margaret bustled around, setting out bowls and cutting thick slices of bread, while Eleanor sank into a chair at the kitchen table as if her strings had been cut. Samuel washed his hands and face at the basin Margaret indicated, then joined them at the table. The stew was rich with beef and vegetables, better than anything Samuel had eaten in months. Margaret kept up a steady stream of conversation, asking Samuel about himself with a directness that reminded him of his own mother. He found himself telling her about his work on various ranches, his plans to save enough money to eventually buy a small piece of land of his own. "And your family?" Margaret asked. "My mother died when I was 15. My father passed when I was 12. I have been on my own since then." Margaret's expression softened with sympathy. "That must have been difficult," I managed. Samuel glanced at Eleanor, who had been quiet during the meal, eating with slow deliberation. "Others have had harder roads." After supper, Margaret insisted that Samuel take the small room she used for storage, which had a cot and enough space for him to lay out his bedroll. "It is not much, but it is better than sleeping on the ground. It is more than generous, thank you." He tended to Buck, making sure the horse had water and feed, then returned to find Eleanor sitting on the front step in the cooling evening air. She looked up as he approached, offering a tentative smile. "I wanted to thank you properly before you leave in the morning. I know I already said it, but you saved my life out there. If you had not shared your camp, your coffee, your supplies, I do not think I would have survived another day. You are stronger than you give yourself credit for." Samuel leaned against the porch post, looking out at the darkening street. "You made it through your father's death, losing your home, being abandoned by your fiancé, and walking alone through dangerous country. That takes strength, or desperation. Sometimes they amount to the same thing." He looked down at her. "What will you do now? Find work, I suppose." "My aunt is kind to take me in, but I will not be a burden on her longer than necessary. I can sew, cook, keep accounts. Surely someone in town needs those skills." "I am certain they do." Samuel found himself reluctant to say goodbye, which surprised him. He had only known Eleanor for a day, but something about her had worked its way under his skin. Her fierce determination, her honesty, the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. "I will be heading out at first light." "Where will you go?" "North to that ranch job I mentioned. If it falls through, I will find something else. There is always work for a man willing to do it." Eleanor nodded, looking down at her hands. "I hope you find what you are looking for, Samuel. You deserve good things." "So do you, Eleanor." The moment stretched between them, full of things unsaid. Then Eleanor stood, brushing off her skirt. "Good night, then. Travel safely." "Good night." Samuel lay awake on the cot for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about green eyes and auburn hair and a voice that had sounded lost when talking about running out of coffee. He told himself that he would ride out in the morning and forget about Eleanor Owens within a week. The trail was no place for sentimental attachments, and he had learned long ago not to let himself want things that were beyond his reach. But when morning came, he found himself moving slowly through his preparations, drawing out each task. He fed and saddled Buck with extra care, checked his tack twice, reorganized his saddlebags for no good reason. When he finally walked back to the house, Margaret was cooking breakfast and Eleanor was setting the table. "Perfect timing," Margaret said cheerfully. "Sit and eat before you go. I will not send you off on an empty stomach." They ate eggs and bacon and fresh biscuits, and Samuel found his resolve weakening with each minute that passed. Finally, as he was preparing to leave, Eleanor walked out with him to where Buck waited. "Be safe," she said, and her eyes were suspiciously bright. "You too." Samuel mounted up, settling into his saddle. He looked down at her, memorizing her face in the morning light. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he said, If you need anything, leave word at the telegraph office in Nogales. I will check back in a few weeks to make sure you are settled." Eleanor's face transformed with her smile, genuine and warm. "I would like that." He rode out of Nogales with the image of that smile burned into his mind. The ranch job outside Tucson fell through. The foreman had already hired someone else by the time Samuel arrived, and there were no other positions available. He spent 2 weeks working odd jobs around Tucson, breaking a few horses for the livery, helping repair a roof damaged in a storm, anything that would pay. But his thoughts kept drifting south to Nogales, to a woman with auburn hair who had drunk his coffee like it was the finest thing she had ever tasted. He told himself he was being foolish. He had known Eleanor for one day. She was likely settling into her new life with her aunt, probably had not thought of him since he had ridden away. He had no claim on her and no reason to ride back, except a feeling in his chest that would not leave him alone. 3 weeks after leaving Nogales, Samuel rode back into town. He stopped first at the telegraph office as he had told Eleanor he would. There were no messages for him, which he tried not to take as disappointment. Then he walked Buck slowly through the streets, unsure of what he was doing or what he hoped to find. He was passing the general store when he saw her. Eleanor was carrying a basket of groceries, her hair neatly braided and her dress clean and mended. She looked healthier than when he had last seen her, the sunburn faded and her face no longer gaunt with exhaustion. She was talking to an older man in a suit who stood too close to her, his posture proprietary in a way that made Samuel's jaw tighten. He dismounted and tied Buck to the hitching post, then walked toward them in time to hear the man say, "Come now, Miss Owens. Surely you can spare a few minutes for supper. I am only trying to be friendly. And I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Peters, but I must decline." Eleanor's voice was polite but firm. "Now, if you will excuse me, I need to get these groceries home. I insist." The man reached for her arm. "A woman in your position should not refuse the attentions of a successful businessman." The lady said no. Samuel stepped up beside them, his voice level but carrying an edge of steel. "I suggest you respect that." Peters turned, his expression darkening as he took in Samuel's dusty trail clothes and the gun at his hip. "This is none of your concern, Cowboy. Actually, it is." Samuel looked at Eleanor, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "Ready to go, Eleanor?" She did not hesitate. "Yes, thank you." She shifted her basket to one arm and took Samuel's offered elbow with her free hand. They walked away, leaving Peters sputtering behind them. Eleanor did not speak until they had turned the corner onto a side street. Then she stopped and turned to face Samuel. "You came back." "I said I would check on you. I thought that was just something people say." Her eyes searched his face. "But you actually came back." "I keep my word." Samuel gestured toward her basket. "Let me carry that for you." She handed it over and they walked toward her aunt's house together. "I found work," Eleanor said. "At the milliner's shop. The owner needed someone who could sew and keep her books. It does not pay much, but it is honest work." "That is good. And my aunt has been wonderful. She insists that I stay as long as I need, but I am saving to rent my own room eventually. I do not want to burden her." I am sure she does not see it as a burden. They reached the house, and Margaret came out onto the porch, her face breaking into a smile when she saw Samuel. "Mr. Lawson, what a pleasant surprise. You will stay for supper, of course." "If it is not too much trouble." "Nonsense. Eleanor, take him inside and get him something to drink. You must be parched from the trail." Over the next hour, Samuel found himself drawn into the warmth of the small household. Margaret was a widow who supported herself by taking in sewing, her husband having died 5 years earlier in a mining accident. She had no children of her own and clearly doted on Eleanor, happy to have family nearby again. During supper, Samuel explained about the failed ranch job and his time in Tucson. "I am thinking of heading further north," he said. "Maybe up toward Prescott. There are ranches up that way that might need hands. Or you could stay in Nogales," Margaret said, her tone casual but her eyes knowing. "I heard that John Harper is looking for someone to help with his freight business. He hauls goods between here and Tucson, needs a man who can handle a team and is not afraid of hard work." "I have experience with freighting," Samuel said, glancing at Eleanor. She was focused on her plate, but he could see the color rising in her cheeks. It might be worth talking to him. "His office is on Main Street next to the bank." Margaret smiled. "I could introduce you tomorrow if you like." Samuel stayed in a boarding house that night, a clean room that cost him $2, but was worth it for the real bed and hot bath. The next morning, Margaret made good on her promise and introduced him to John Harper, a grizzled man in his 60s who looked Samuel over with a skeptical eye. "You ever run freight before?" Harper asked. 2 years down in Texas, hauled everything from lumber to livestock feed. You know how to handle trouble. I can take care of myself and the cargo." Harper nodded slowly. "I will give you a trial run. Take a load to Tucson day after tomorrow. Bring back the goods I have waiting there. You do right by me, and we will talk about steady work. Pay is $20 a month plus a percentage of each successful run." It was fair money for the work. Samuel accepted, shaking Harper's hand to seal the agreement. He saw Eleanor that evening when she finished work at the milliner's shop. She came out into the golden late afternoon light and found him waiting across the street, leaning against a post. Her face lit up when she saw him, and Samuel felt something warm spread through his chest at the sight. "I heard you took the job with Mr. Harper," she said, falling into step beside him as they walked. "News travels fast. It is a small town." Eleanor glanced up at him, a smile playing at her lips. "Does this mean you will be staying in Nogales, for a while at least? Steady work is hard to turn down." They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, then Eleanor said, "I am glad you came back, Samuel. I miss talking to you." "I miss talking to you too." It became a pattern over the following weeks. Samuel would make his freight runs, gone for 3 or 4 days at a time, and when he returned, he would find his way to Eleanor. They would walk together through the town, talking about everything and nothing. She told him about growing up on the ranch, about her father's dreams and disappointments, about the books she had loved reading by lamplight when the day's work was done. He told her about his years on the trail, the places he had seen, the people he had known. He learned that she loved thunderstorms and hated spiders, that she could play the piano but had not touched one since leaving her childhood home, that her favorite food was apple pie, and her favorite color was blue. She learned that he had a scar on his shoulder from being thrown against a fence post by a spooked horse, that he could not carry a tune to save his life, that he dreamed of having land of his own someday where he could build a house and raise cattle and finally put down roots. They did not speak of what was growing between them, but Samuel felt it with every glance, every accidental touch of hands, every smile that lasted a heartbeat too long. He found himself thinking of Eleanor during his long hours on the freight wagon, imagining her face when he told her about something interesting he had seen. He bought her small gifts when he was in Tucson, things that made him think of her, a ribbon the color of her eyes, a book of poems, a carved wooden hair comb. Eleanor accepted each gift with a blush and a brightness in her expression that made Samuel want to give her the world. Margaret watched them with knowing eyes and said nothing, though Samuel caught her smiling to herself more than once. 2 months after Samuel had returned to Nogales, Eleanor invited him to a church social. They stood together under the stars, listening to music from a fiddle and watching couples dance. Samuel had never been much for social gatherings, but with Eleanor beside him, it felt right. "You dance?" Eleanor asked. "Not well." "Neither do I." She smiled up at him. "But maybe we could be terrible at it together." He led her to where others were dancing, acutely aware of his hand at her waist and her hand in his. They moved awkwardly at first, both of them trying too hard, but then Eleanor laughed at them both and Samuel relaxed. They swayed more than danced, closer than was strictly proper, and Samuel did not care who noticed. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "That first morning when you stumbled into my camp, when I gave you coffee and watched you drink it like it was the best thing you had ever tasted, I thought you were the bravest person I had ever met. And every day since then, every moment I have spent with you, you have proven me right." He paused, gathering his courage. "I love you. I know we have only known each other a few months and I do not have much to offer you, but if you would consider it, I would like to court you properly. With a view toward marriage, if you would have me." Eleanor's eyes were shining with tears, but she was smiling. "Samuel Lawson, I fell in love with you the morning you shared your coffee with me, when you spoke to me with kindness and did not make me feel ashamed for needing help. When you offered me safety without asking for anything in return. I would be honored to let you court me." He kissed her then, right there in front of half the town, a gentle press of lips that felt like coming home. They were married 3 months later in the small church in Nogales, with Margaret crying happy tears and John Harper standing up as Samuel's witness. Eleanor wore a simple dress of pale blue that she and Margaret had sewn together, with a wreath of desert wildflowers in her hair. Samuel had never seen anything more beautiful in his life. Harper had given Samuel a bonus after 6 successful freight runs, and Samuel had used part of it to rent a small house on the edge of town. It had 2 rooms and needed work, but Eleanor declared it perfect. They spent their first weeks as husband and wife fixing up the house, painting walls and mending the roof and planting a small garden in the yard. At night, lying in bed with Eleanor in his arms, Samuel marveled at how his life had changed. He had been drifting for so long, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. But here, with Eleanor beside him and a future stretching out before them, he finally felt settled. "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor asked, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his chest. "How lucky I am. How different my life would be if you had not walked into my camp that morning." "I think about that too." She propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him in the moonlight coming through the window. "If my horse had not gone lame exactly where he did. If you had already broken camp and moved on, if you had been anyone other than who you are." "I would have waited," Samuel said, pulling her down for a kiss. "Somehow I would have found you. That is not possible, maybe not, but I believe it anyway." Eleanor smiled against his lips. "You are a romantic, Samuel Lawson. Only with you." The months turned into years. Samuel continued working for Harper, eventually becoming his partner when the older man decided to semi-retire. Eleanor kept working at the milliner's shop until she became pregnant with their first child, a boy they named after Samuel's father, Thomas. 2 years later came another son, James. Then 3 years after that, a daughter they named Rose, after Samuel's mother. They saved their money carefully, and when a small ranch came up for sale north of town, Samuel bought it with Eleanor's enthusiastic blessing. It was only 50 acres with a modest house, but it was theirs. Samuel continued the freight business while building up a small herd of cattle, working dawn to dusk, but never complaining because he was building something for his family. Eleanor transformed the ranch house into a home, her touches evident in every room. She planted roses by the front door and vegetables in a large garden. She sewed curtains for the windows and braided rugs for the floors. She filled the house with love and laughter and the wonderful chaos of raising 3 children. Margaret moved to the ranch when Thomas was 5, taking a room in the house and becoming an indispensable part of their daily lives. She minded the children when Samuel and Eleanor both had work to do, taught them their letters and numbers, and told them stories about their mother's childhood. On quiet evenings, after the children were asleep and Margaret had retired to her room, Samuel and Eleanor would sit on the porch together and watch the sun set over the Arizona desert. Sometimes they talked about their day, about the children, about plans for the ranch. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, Eleanor's hand in Samuel's, content just to be together. "You ever regret it?" Eleanor asked one evening. "Taking me on that day, your life would have been simpler without me." Samuel turned to look at her, this woman who had walked into his camp exhausted and afraid but refusing to give up. This woman who had accepted his coffee with gratitude and his proposal with joy. This woman who had given him everything he had never known he wanted. A home. A family. A purpose beyond just surviving. Simpler, he agreed, but emptier. "You and the children, this ranch, this life we have built together, it is everything. You warmed more than just my morning that day, Eleanor. You warmed my whole life." She leaned her head against his shoulder, fitting perfectly against his side as she always had. "Your words warm me too. Every day. Good." He kissed the top of her head. "That is my job now for the rest of our lives. Promise, promise." The years continued to pass, marked by the growth of their children and the steady expansion of their ranch. Thomas grew into a strong young man who loved working with the cattle as much as his father did. James had his mother's head for numbers and took over managing the books for both the ranch and the freight business. Rose was fierce and independent, declaring at age 12 that she wanted to be a horse breaker like her father. Samuel and Eleanor grew older together, their hair turning gray and their faces acquiring lines that mapped out years of laughter and love. The ranch prospered under their careful management, growing to 200 acres and supporting a healthy herd. The freight business remained successful even as the railroad began to change the territory, adapting to haul goods that the trains could not easily reach. Margaret lived to see all 3 of her great-nieces and nephews grown, passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 82. They buried her on the ranch, under a mesquite tree where she had loved to sit and watch the children play. Eleanor grieved deeply for the aunt who had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go, but found comfort in the knowledge that Margaret had spent her final years surrounded by family and love. When Thomas was 20, he married a young woman from town named Sarah. James followed suit 2 years later, bringing home a bride named Catherine. They built houses on the ranch property, and soon Samuel and Eleanor had grandchildren to spoil and love. Rose proved harder to match, declaring that she had no interest in marriage and would rather work with horses than keep house for some man. But when she was 23, she met a gentle-natured man named David who worked at the feed store and loved horses as much as she did. Their courtship was rocky and full of arguments, but they married the following spring in a ceremony that had Eleanor crying happy tears all over again. Samuel was 60 when his health began to fail, his body worn out from decades of hard physical labor. Eleanor fussed over him, making him rest more and work less, enlisting their sons to take over the heavy labor. Samuel grumbled about being treated like an invalid but secretly loved the extra time he got to spend with his wife. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children and grandchildren, 9 grandchildren in total by then, ranging from Thomas's oldest son at 17 down to Rose's baby daughter at 6 months. Samuel looked around the table at the family he and Eleanor had built together and felt a satisfaction so deep it almost hurt. That night, lying in bed with Eleanor curled against his side as she had been for 40 years, Samuel said, "I need you to know something." "What is it?" Eleanor's voice was sleepy content. "That morning you walked into my camp, I was thinking about moving on, maybe going to California, trying something different. I was restless and feeling like I was wasting my life just drifting from job to job. You never told me that. Because meeting you changed everything. You gave me a reason to stay, to build, to put down roots. Everything good in my life started that morning when I shared my coffee with you." Eleanor lifted her head to look at him, her green eyes still as beautiful to him as they had been when she was 21. "You saved my life that day, Samuel, but you also gave me a life worth living. You gave me love and family and a home. You gave me everything. We gave each other everything." She kissed him, soft and sweet and full of 40 years of love. "Promise me something, anything, that you will fight to stay with me as long as you can. I am not ready to let you go yet. I promise. I will be right here beside you for as long as I am able." Samuel lived 5 more years, long enough to see 2 more grandchildren born, and to watch his oldest grandson begin courting a young woman from a neighboring ranch. Long enough to see Rose's horse breeding program succeed beyond anyone's expectations, producing animals known throughout the territory for their quality and temperament. Long enough to know that the ranch and the family he had built with Eleanor would endure long after he was gone. He died peacefully on a warm spring morning, Eleanor holding his hand and their children and grandchildren gathered around his bed. His last words were, "Thank you for the coffee that morning, for everything." Eleanor understood. She squeezed his hand and whispered, "Thank you for sharing it with me, for sharing your whole life with me." Eleanor lived another 12 years as a widow, remaining strong and active well into her 80s. She spent her days working in her garden, playing with her great-grandchildren, and sitting on the porch where she and Samuel had spent so many evenings together. She never remarried, saying that she had already found the love of her life and nothing could replace what she and Samuel had shared. On the anniversary of the day they had met each passing year, Eleanor would make a pot of strong black coffee and sit on the porch alone, drinking it slowly and remembering the morning a dusty, weary woman had stumbled into a cowboy's camp and found salvation. She would remember how he had shared his coffee without hesitation, had offered help without asking for anything in return, had looked at her with kindness when she had felt worthless. She would remember falling in love with a man who saw her not as a burden or a convenience, but as a person worthy of respect and care. She would remember their first kiss, their wedding day, the births of their children, the thousands of small moments that had made up their life together. And she would whisper into the desert air, "I love you still. I will always love you." When Eleanor finally passed at the age of 88, she was surrounded by 3 children, 11 grandchildren, and 17 great-grandchildren. They buried her beside Samuel on the ranch, under the endless Arizona sky they had both loved. The headstone was simple, bearing both their names and the dates of their lives, but at the bottom was carved a single line that Rose had chosen. She warmed his morning, he warmed her life. The ranch continued on, passed down through the generations, a testament to what 2 people could build when they loved each other truly and worked together toward a common dream. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the air was still and the sun was just beginning to rise, those who lived there swore they could smell fresh coffee brewing and hear the soft murmur of voices speaking words of love. The story of Samuel and Eleanor became a family legend, told and retold to each new generation. How they had met when she was at her lowest point, and he had helped her without hesitation. How a simple act of sharing coffee had led to a love that lasted a lifetime. How two people who had started with nothing but each other had built something that endured long after they were gone. Their grandchildren grew old telling the story to their grandchildren, and those grandchildren told it to theirs. The details might have changed slightly with each telling, embellished and romanticized, but the heart of it remained true. A cowboy had shared his coffee with a weary traveler, and her words had warmed more than just his morning. They had warmed his heart, his life, and ultimately his soul. It was a love story that had started with a simple act of kindness and had grown into something that transcended time and death. It was proof that sometimes the most important moments in life are the ones where we choose to help someone without expecting anything in return, where we offer what little we have to someone who needs it more, where we see another person's humanity and respond with compassion. Samuel had shared his coffee because it was the right thing to do. He had brought Eleanor to safety because she needed help. He had fallen in love with her because she was brave and strong and beautiful inside and out. And she had loved him back with the same fierce devotion, building a life and a family that became their shared legacy. The ranch still stood more than a century later, still owned by their descendants, still a working cattle operation. The house had been expanded and modernized, but the original rooms that Samuel and Eleanor had lived in were preserved, kept as they had been. The front porch where they had spent so many evenings together was still there, and family members still gathered there on quiet nights to watch the sunset and remember the love story that had started it all. In the main room of the house hung a photograph, old and faded but treasured. It showed Samuel and Eleanor on their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Samuel's arm was around Eleanor's shoulders, and she was leaning into him with a smile on her face. Anyone who looked at that photograph could see the love between them, still strong after 40 years, still burning bright. And on the mantel below the photograph sat 2 tin cups, battered and old, the same cups that Samuel had poured coffee into on that long-ago morning. They had been kept all these years, passed down through the family as precious heirlooms, because they represented more than just cups. They represented the beginning of everything, the moment when 2 strangers had become friends, and then lovers, and then partners in building a life together. The story of how a cowboy shared his coffee with a weary traveler, and how her words warmed more than just his morning, was more than just a family legend. It was a reminder that love could be found in the most unexpected places, that kindness mattered, that the smallest gestures could change lives. It was proof that true love existed, that it could last a lifetime, and that it left echoes that resonated through generations. Samuel and Eleanor had lived ordinary lives by most standards. They had worked hard, raised their family, built their ranch. They had not been famous or wealthy or powerful, but they had loved each other deeply and truly, and in the end, that was what mattered most. Their love had been the foundation upon which everything else was built, and that foundation had proven strong enough to support not just them, but generations of their family. On the anniversary of their meeting each year, the family would gather at the ranch for a celebration. They would make coffee using Samuel's old pot, pour it into tin cups like the ones he had used, and toast the memory of the 2 people who had started it all. The oldest member of the family would tell the story again, making sure that even the youngest children knew about Samuel and Eleanor and the love that had brought their family into being. And as they sat together under the Arizona sky, drinking coffee and sharing stories, and surrounded by the love that Samuel and Eleanor had created, they understood that some things truly were eternal. Love, family, the simple act of sharing what you have with someone who needs it. the warmth that comes not from coffee but from words spoken with kindness and received with gratitude. Samuel had shared his coffee with Eleanor on a dusty morning in 1883, never knowing that he was changing both their lives forever. He had seen a woman in need and had responded with compassion. She had accepted his help with dignity and gratitude, and had seen in him a goodness that she had thought no longer existed in the world. From that simple beginning had grown a love story for the ages. A story of two people finding each other when they both needed it most. Of building a life together through hard work and dedication. Of creating a family that would carry their legacy forward long after they were gone. Of proving that true love was not just a fairy tale but a real and lasting thing that could be found if you were open to it. As the sun set on another anniversary celebration, with family members heading home and the ranch settling into quiet for the night, the current owners of the property sat on the old porch and looked out at the land that Samuel and Eleanor had loved. They thought about the two people who had sat in this same spot more than 100 years ago, holding hands and watching the sunset, content in the knowledge that they had found in each other everything they had ever needed. And they raised their coffee cups in a silent toast to Samuel and Eleanor, to the love that had started with a simple act of sharing and had grown into something that would last forever. To the cowboy who had shared his coffee with a weary traveler, and to the woman whose words had warmed more than just his morning. They had warmed his entire life and created a legacy that would never fade. The story ended as all great love stories should, with the knowledge that what Samuel and Eleanor had built together would endure. Their love lived on in their descendants, in the ranch they had created, in the family traditions that had been passed down through generations. They had started with nothing but each other, and a pot of coffee shared on a dusty morning, and they had turned it into everything. And that, ultimately, was the true magic of their story. Not that they had lived some grand adventure or overcome impossible odds, though in their own way they had done both, but that they had found each other, had recognized something special in that first meeting, and had chosen to build a life together based on love, respect, and partnership. They had proven that sometimes the most extraordinary things come from the most ordinary beginnings, and that a simple act of kindness can change the world, or at least the world of two people who would go on to create something beautiful together. Samuel and Eleanor's love story was one worth telling and retelling, worth preserving and remembering, worth celebrating. Because it reminded everyone who heard it that love was real, that kindness mattered, that taking a chance on someone could lead to the greatest joy imaginable. It reminded them that sometimes the person you are meant to spend your life with shows up dusty and exhausted and desperate on an ordinary morning, and all you have to do is offer them coffee and compassion and the willingness to see who they really are. That was what Samuel had done for Eleanor and what she had done for him in return. They had seen each other truly, had chosen each other freely, and had loved each other completely. And in doing so, they had created something that transcended their individual lives and became part of something larger, something that would continue on long after they were gone. The legacy of a cowboy who shared his coffee with a weary traveler, and the woman whose words warmed more than just his morning, would live on forever in the hearts and memories of all who came after them. And that was the greatest happy ending anyone could ask for.